The air in the Forrester mansion was heavy with anticipation for yet another wedding that promised a new beginning. Ridge and Taylor had stood in front of each other many times before, lured back by love, history, a feeling of family and destiny. However, something always appeared to intervene, as if fate was unwilling to provide them long-term tranquility. This time was no different. Guests had assembled, whispers of adoration filling the rooms accented with roses, candles, and a warm glow of promise. Everyone seemed to believe that Ridge and Taylor's union would eventually endure the test of time. But in the background another storm was brewing, one carried by Brooke Logan's fragile, broken heart. Brooke had been through more heartache than most women could comprehend, especially when it came to Ridge. Their relationship has always been one of loyalty, betrayal, forgiveness, and grief. No matter how many times she told herself she was going to move on, her heart refused to let him go. She believed they were soulmates, destined to find their way back to each other despite the obstacles. But this time, as she watched him preparing to marry Taylor again, she felt something deep within her fracture. The idea of standing by and appearing to be graceful and accepting sounded absurd. Everyone stared at her as if she was supposed to slip into the background, but Brooke was never the type of woman to simply disappear. Her suffering was intense, and it engulfed her. She sat trembling in her bedroom, away from the wedding. The sound of her heartbeat drowned out the music coming from downstairs. Her eyes were puffy from sobbing, and her appearance in the mirror was unidentifiable, a mix of sadness and despair. On the nightstand was a bottle of sleeping tablets, prescribed weeks before when her nights were spent with tossing and turning. Brooke had been told by the doctor to be careful, but she didn't care at the time. She simply cared about relieving the pain, even only for a little while. The voices in her head told her she'd lost Ridge forever, that Taylor had finally won, and that her fate as the perpetual outsider was sealed. She did not want to hear their voices anymore. The wedding ceremony has begun downstairs. Guests were smiling, Taylor looked stunning in her gown, and Ridge appeared solemn but determined. He had promised himself that he would make this work, that he would devote his entire attention to Taylor, his children's mother, the woman who had always been there. Still, deep within him there was disquiet, a hesitation he dared not express. As the officiant began to speak, memories of Brooke's laughter, touch, and presence flooded back into his head. He tried to push them away, but they clung firmly, a memory of a love that wouldn't die. Brooke, overcome with pain, opened the bottle and poured the tablets into her hand. Tears obscured her vision as she whispered Ridge's name like a prayer, hoping he could hear her through the walls. She convinced herself that this wasn't about terminating her life, but about fleeing, finding a moment of silence in the never-ending storm. But as she raised the pills to her lips, fate intervened in the most horrible way. Her phone buzzed and a message appeared on the screen. "Thinking of you today. You're stronger than you realize." It came from her daughter, Hope, who was ignorant of her mother's impending surrender. The message shattered something in Brooke, reminding her that she wasn't alone and that her children still needed her. However, the harm had already been done. She had swallowed more than she should have, and dizziness soon followed. At the ceremony, murmurs began to spread. Donna became concerned when she realized Brooke had gone missing. She knew her sister better than anybody else and recognized how delicate Brooke had become. She excused herself and slipped upstairs to locate her. What she discovered chilled her blood. Brooke was slumped against the bed, barely aware, with an empty pill bottle beside her. Donna screamed her name, shaking her, and begged her to wake up. Panic poured through her as she yelled for aid, her voice echoing through the hallways and disrupting the wedding below. Ridge and Taylor's vows were forgotten as they stood frozen at the altar, causing chaos. Ridge's heart sank as he heard Donna's anguished cries. Without hesitation, he dashed upstairs, his tuxedo brushing against the polished railing as he took 2 steps at a time. When he entered the room, the sight of Brooke virtually motionless devastated him. He dropped on his knees beside her, his hands quivering as he attempted to wake her. "Brooke, stay with me. Please do not do this." His voice broke raw from terror. In that moment, the wedding, the vows, and the carefully crafted picture of moving on were all irrelevant. All that mattered was the woman in front of him. Taylor followed, her gown streaming behind her, and as she realized what had transpired, her heart sank. As much as she desired this day, As much as she wished to recapture Ridge's affection, she couldn't deny the destruction before her. Taylor saw Brooke's sorrow, which had drove her to such an act, and for the first time, she grasped the extent of Brooke's suffering. She knelt on the opposite side of the bed, clutching Brooke's hand and offering encouragement. Despite their competition and years of anger, Taylor could not bear the thought of another woman dying in such a way. The sight seemed too human, too frail. Paramedics were dispatched, rushing into the mansion with urgency. Guests stood motionless, some crying and others whispering prayers. Hope came in tears, her voice quivering as she implored her mother to fight. Ridge wouldn't let go of Brooke's hand, his gaze never leaving her face as they wheeled her out on the stretcher. His entire universe changed in that moment. The concept of a wedding, a vow spoken with Taylor, seemed insignificant in comparison to the possibility of losing Brooke forever. In the hospital, hours felt like days. The family gathered in the waiting area, clinging to each other and tormented by uncertainty. Ridge sat quietly, head in his hands, guilt gnawing at him. He couldn't resist the feeling that his decisions had brought Brooke here, that his reluctance to totally commit had crushed her spirit. Taylor sat nearby, her emotions knotted together. She had wanted Ridge and a life with him, but not like this, not at the expense of another woman's anguish. Watching Ridge's pain, she realized that his heart was never completely free to give to her. His spirit was bound to Brooke, regardless of how much history they shared. When the doctor finally reappeared with an update, the room fell silent. Brooke was stable yet delicate. The overdose had been severe, but she was strong and had a chance to recover. Everyone felt relieved, yet the weight of what had almost been lost lingered. Ridge exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and said a little prayer of thankfulness. He silently promised himself that he would not let her slide through his fingers again, not like this. When Brooke eventually opened her eyes, the world around her became fuzzy, with the sterile aroma of the hospital flooding her senses. Ridge's face was the first she noticed, sitting alongside her, his eyes red with tears. He stretched for her hand carefully, fearing she would draw away. "You scared me," he muttered. "Never do that again. Please." Brooke's lips trembled as tears streamed down her face. "I didn't want to lose you," she said faintly. "I couldn't see you marry her. I couldn't breathe." Her voice broke, revealing the raw reality she had worked so hard to hide. Ridge leaned closer, stroking a piece of hair away from her face. "You'll never lose me," he whispered softly, knowing the journey ahead would be difficult. He couldn't deny his feelings for her after this. Taylor, standing discreetly in the doorway, overheard his comments. Pain flickered across her features, but she didn't intervene. For once, she prioritized compassion before rivalry. She whispered a silent goodbye to the dream she had carried for so long, realizing that love sometimes required stepping aside. The consequences of that day reverberated throughout everyone's lives. Brooke's brush with tragedy prompted her to confront the darkness she had let to grow inside of her. With her children's help and Ridge's commitment, she began a slow trek back to health. Ridge, too, found himself reassessing everything. He could no longer deny that his heart was divided. The fact was obvious. He belonged with Brooke, whether it was easy or not. The wedding with Taylor became a ghost, a recollection of something that never should have happened. Taylor, though upset, found a weird calm in letting go, determined to concentrate on herself, her job, and her children. She knew she deserved better than a man whose heart was elsewhere. Brooke's recovery eventually became a symbol of tenacity. She learned to rely on her loved ones and to find meaning in her own life beyond Ridge. But she also regained a love for him that had lasted, despite everything. Their narrative was far from flawless, riddled with mistakes and grief, but it remained unshakable. Brooke interrupted Ridge and Taylor's wedding not with words or theatrical statements, but with a cry from the depths of her soul. A cry so strong that it drew the ceremony to a halt and reminded everyone of the vulnerability of love and life. Finally, the catastrophe served as a watershed moment in their lives, changing their destiny. Ridge recognized that love was not about convenience or history, but about the one person whose heart refused to let go. Brooke found that even at her lowest point, she was not alone, and that her life was still very important to people who loved her. And Taylor, in her grace, realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is to let go. Brooke moved on her bed, her lips parting slightly as if to test the strength of her voice. Ridge leaned in closer, grabbing her hand firmly. Her eyelashes flickered open, and she saw him again, this time looking at her with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. "You stayed," she muttered hoarsely. "Of course I stayed," Ridge replied, his voice full of intense emotion. "I was not going anywhere. Not after everything you did. Not after what almost occurred." Tears filled her eyes. I could not handle it anymore. Seeing you at the altar with Taylor made me feel like my heart was being ripped apart piece by piece. I figured if I just slept I wouldn't feel the agony." Her voice cracked and shame swept across her features. "But I didn't intend to. I did not want to leave my kids. I did not want to leave you." Ridge's chest clenched. He softly brushed her hair from her forehead. "Never assume you're alone in this. You mean too much to too many people, including Hope, Donna, your entire family, and me." He paused on his final phrase, but it came out with irrefutable truth. Taylor stood silently outside the room. She had arrived early, determined to check in, but she froze when she overheard their conversation. Every phrase ripped into her, reminding her that while Ridge respected her and loved their family, his soul was elsewhere. For years, she had denied the reality, thinking herself that time and history would protect Ridge's heart. Yet, when she watched him cradle Brooke's hand with such care, she realized the futility. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she swiftly wiped it away, forcing herself to breathe through the pain. When Taylor finally went inside, Brooke's eyes flooded with humiliation once more. "I'm sorry," Brooke muttered. "I didn't want to ruin your day. I never wanted to take from you again." Taylor glanced at her, her emotions battling inside. Anger, despair, and compassion all swirled together. But, in the end, empathy prevailed. She leaned closer and lightly caressed Brooke's arm. "You did not ruin anything. What counts is that you are alive, Brooke. That you are here. If Ridge and I were destined to be, nothing could have prevented it. But maybe this was life's way of revealing the truth." Her voice were firm, but her eyes were filled with pain. Ridge stared between them, torn, but the decision had already been engraved on his heart. Taylor sensed it even if he hadn't said it out loud. For the first time she chose peace over conflict. Back at the Forrester mansion, murmurs about the almost wedding flooded the air. Steffi, who was extremely protective of her mother, complained to Thomas about Ridge's tendency to return to Brooke at any cost. "Mom deserves better," she said, her voice harsh with displeasure. "She deserves a man who won't leave her hanging the second Brooke snaps her fingers." Thomas nodded, but he wasn't certain. He'd seen Ridge's expression in the hospital, almost breaking down alongside Brooke. It was not about manipulation this time. It was about love, the type that could never be broken no matter how much it wounded others. Hope returned to the hospital and joined her mother, squeezing Brooke's hand tightly. "You scared me more than I've ever been scared in my life," she admitted, her tears flowing freely. "Never do that again. You are stronger than this. You are our rock, even when you don't feel like it." Brooke's glare softened as she stared at her daughter and Ridge. Slowly, the shroud of hopelessness lifted. She understood how close she had come to abandoning everything she cared about, and a new determination ignited within her. She would rebuild piece by piece. She refused to let her pain define her again. Ridge regarded the day as a watershed moment. The wedding with Taylor would become a distant memory, an unfinished chapter because it was never meant to be. His heart, torn and battered, recognized the truth. And that reality was sitting in front of him, fragile but yet shining. Brooke Logan, the woman he had almost lost but could never let go of. For Taylor, it marked the beginning of acceptance. She would heal on her own terms, drawing strength from her own value rather than Ridge's affection. Because sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is walk away from a dream that was never truly yours. For years, the story of that day would be whispered in whispers. How a wedding was called off without words or controversy, but with a silent cry for aid that changed everything.